Record to the cloud. All right, so we have a file to download today, University Crime. So go ahead and get that file downloaded and open. I think I renamed it because I know what I'm going to want to name it when I upload it to the blog. But here's our data. This is the same data that we worked with last time, except instead of being in 48 different files, it is in, it's just kind of aggregated here. So what we're about today is learning how to automate pivot tables. This is a pretty good set of data for learning about pivot tables. So remember, this is crimes known to law enforcement that were committed on or reported on university campuses from the years 2006 to 2010. So if we look at this data, this first line here says the report year 2006. We're looking at the state of Alabama, Auburn University, Montgomery campus. This actually isn't crime, it's just how it's informational. The enrollment of that class, of that campus is 5,128. They didn't have any assault or auto theft reported, but they did have 8 cases of larceny. Oh, by the way, what's the difference between larceny and burglary, do you know? And we have robbery, larceny, and burglary. They're all similar. Yeah, you think you know? So robbery, I think, involves the threat of physical force. Yeah, so knife, gun, you're being robbed at gunpoint. Yeah, that's robbery. That's right. Burglary is you're actually going into a building to do. And then larceny is you're taking something from somebody absent the threat of physical violence. You know, you just walk up to someone, take their computer away and walk away. That's larceny. It's not robbery or burglary. Anyway, there you go. So anyway, they had 8 cases of larceny. I'm not sure if you, presumably if you left your computer on the desk and you walked away from it and someone took it, that would also be larceny. That's not burglary or robbery, so that's probably also larceny. Okay. So let's just kind of poll you and let me see where you are. Used to be when I first started teaching automating pivot tables, maybe 10% of the students felt conversant with working with pivot tables. That's probably largely changed now. I'm expecting probably about half or more. But just raise your hand if you're saying, you know what, I'm pretty comfortable just working with pivot tables, not through VBA, but just using a pivot table. So you're relatively comfortable. Yeah, so about half of us so far. And it's kind of clear by the conversations going on that some of you weren't really voting. So maybe more than half are already pretty comfortable. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to build a pivot table together so we can kind of get familiar with the data. Then we'll delete that pivot table and we'll record ourselves building that self-same pivot table. And then we'll look at that code to modify it and learn about pivot tables. So the code that gets recorded for pivot tables, as is common in a few things, that you record yourself making a pivot table and you say, great, I want to run that code will fail. So you can never just say record a pivot table and then make another pivot table. It just will never work. Just because the recorder is not sophisticated enough to make the code general. But it will give us the building blocks that we need. And so we'll go through and we'll get familiar with it and clean it up. And the code will look so much better once we're done with it than the way that it records. And it will be general so that we can produce multiple pivot tables as we go. All right, so let's just go ahead and do a pivot table. I remember when Excel 2007 came out, when they introduced the ribbon. Most of you have never used Excel without the ribbon, the old menu structure. But I remember looking for where they put the pivot table. That was the thing. Where did you put them? There were whole websites out there where you could like go to the old Excel menu system on the website, and it would show you where it was on the ribbon, you know, because we all knew where everything was in the menu. It was a real nightmare. And I remember looking for about a half hour trying to find where do you create a pivot table? Because pivot table seems like a pretty advanced thing, and I thought advanced things should be over to the right. I never dreamed it would be the first thing. I mean, what's in the first? It's like simple stuff like cut, copy, and paste. That's what belongs over here on the left. Anyway, here's how we do the pivot table. So I'm going to select somewhere in my data and create a pivot table, and I'm going to accept all these defaults. So it says it's automatically found the range. It knows doesn't make any sense to create a pivot table on a single cell. So you must mean the contiguous data, which it did that. We'll put it on a new worksheet. That is great. And it turns out the very first time I ever tried to make a pivot table was probably like 1995 or so. And pivot tables came into Excel in 1993. And I think I had read an article, or maybe someone had mentioned about how great a pivot table was. And I thought, oh, what's this whole pivot table? What kind of a buzz around pivot table? Let me go look at a pivot table. And then, but back in the day, when you made a pivot table, when you did what we just did, it came to here, but it didn't automatically bring the fields up. So this was what you got. And you don't even get the tabs selected with anything showing up here because there's no tabs. It was just boom, here you are. And I thought, hey, I made a pivot table. That's great. And I said, well, so what's next? I'm like right-clicking it. What do you do here? I don't even think it was a show fields list option in the day. I probably spent about 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do with the pivot table. I didn't have any data I was trying to analyze. I was just curious what a pivot table was. I gave up. It was years before I actually used a pivot table after I couldn't figure it out. So let's go ahead and come over here to the pivot fields. And let's just start bringing some of this data in. I'm going to bring the value down. This is why we have like the number of our the crimes that were reported and so forth. That'll come as our values. Let's go ahead and put, in fact, if we look at this number right here, oops, apparently you can drill into that. I didn't want to drill in. What does that number mean? If you were to give some English interpretation of that number, what does that number mean? It's not all crime. It's like 30 million. That would be a lot, even for college campuses. So, yeah. It's not the value, no, because there's no, all we have here is, in this data set is counts. We don't know how much was stolen. Was it a car that was stolen or was it a pencil? We don't know. Yeah? So it's all the crimes reported plus all the enrollment for all the years that we have here. This is an utterly useless number. I mean, oh boy, look at that number. It's just all that whole column summed up, but there's all kinds of different data in that column. So, kind of the first thing, anytime you're starting to analyze data, it's like, let me make sure I understand really what this data is. So let's spend a couple minutes with that as well. So let's go ahead and split this out at least. I'm going to bring the state down as a row header. And so now we still have that same number. It's still pretty useless, but at least it's useless now 50 times because we've got one for each state. It's even more useless. Actually, I think there's only 44 states in this data set. I'm not sure why we have some that haven't reported. Might have just been that disk they sent me didn't have all the data. I don't know. But I'm also going to bring on, let's see, let's go ahead and bring something across the header. So I'm going to bring the type. Let me go ahead and bring the type in. And remember that type column is just, what is it? Is it crime or is it informational? There's only two values here. So I'll bring type in as a column header. And so now we finally have split this data out. So now this number right here, I got to quit drilling in. Delete. So now this one actually means, this number means something. Who can tell me what this one means? Yeah, this is all crimes reported to law enforcement that occurred on university campuses in the state of Alabama across our 2006 to 2010 window. That's it. There was 6,309. There's less reports in Alaska, surprisingly. Only 600 there. Arizona has more. I'm not sure. I wonder how Arizona and Alabama compare just to university population. Arizona has ASU, which is a huge, huge school. Maybe that's just kind of swamping things here. I don't know. Okay, so these numbers. Oh yeah, we got enrollment right here. We don't have to wonder about that. We can ask them. So enrollment here total, yeah, it's not quite twice. So yeah, relatively, it's about the same rate of crime. It looks like in these two places. So, but now someone tell me what this number means here. So in C5, what is this number? Is this the number of students enrolled in colleges in Alabama across our date range? Or probably the ones committing crimes are in here too. It's not enrolled students. What is it? In fact, if we look down at the summary of this column, that is not the number of university students during the years 2006 to 2010. Why not? It's tempting to look at it that way, but why isn't it? First of all, look at the number. What is it? It's 30 million. You think we had 30 million students enrolled in colleges during those 4 years? Nowhere near that. That's a lot. I mean, that's, our population, the whole population is only 10 times that, like 350 million or so. So the thought here? So I think this number that we see here, this is all students enrolled at the Montgomery campus of Auburn University. In the back. Yes, so if I'm a freshman in 2006, then I go for 4 years, I'm there for 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. I'm going to be counted in this number, in the 2007 number, the 2008 number. And so every year there's like 3/4, or maybe not quite 3/4 because there's some attrition, but there's a lot of overlap between which students are reported in each year. So again, really important to understand what the numbers mean. So that's still not a very useful number. It's like the total of like student enrollment years, so if you were enrolled this year and next year, you're counted twice in that. Okay, but let's go ahead and see what we can do to split this out a little bit more. And that's the whole point for a pivot table, is to summarize a set of data across multiple dimensions simultaneously. So we're not just looking for the sum of this numbers, but now we're splitting it out across both by state and by what kind of information it is. Let's go ahead and bring the label in as a secondary column header. Put it in the wrong place. Let's put it over here. So now we've got our crime now is broken up into the 8 different categories. Arson. California has a lot of arson, 273 cases of arson. Yeah, that's interesting. That's way more than the ratio of other assault and these other ones. That's huge. And then let's do the same thing for our row filter. So we've got state, but let's drill down by school and by campus. So now we've got these numbers. Now we're getting us right down to specific crimes. So that number right there says, I like to click more than I should. Says in the whole data set, we have 11 assaults that were reported at Jacksonville State University. If I want to get down to specific years, I can put the report year as a report filter. And now I could narrow this whole thing down just to 2009. And now that number is really a pretty meaningful number. It says at Jacksonville State University, we had 2 assaults reported in the year 2009. But the trouble is now we're really so big, we can't really get a look at this data kind of at a higher level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse the detail here. So I'm going to come to crime and right click crime, choose expand, collapse, and collapse the entire field. So now we're back to where we were before, but the underlying data is in there. So I can expand crime and look at the crime numbers. We'll do the same thing here. So I'll come to, I'll pick a school. So here's University of Alabama. I'll right click that one and choose collapse entire field. And then I'll do the same thing again at the state level, collapse entire field. And now we're back to a table that we can kind of look at and consume. But when we're curious to know, what's going on here in California? Where is all this arson happening? We can kind of drill in and see, wow, a whole bunch is happening at California State University. Well, they are pretty big, so that might make sense. We can drill in and see where is it happening at which campus and so forth. So that's pretty nice. One more thing I'd like to do here is probably roll my report year back to show all the data. But I don't want to show all of these. I just want to focus on a few Western states. So I'm going to not select all. Maybe we'll choose Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. Colorado, Wyoming. Where'd you go, Wyoming? Oh, all the way to the bottom. Utah. let's see, who's the other state that's in the four corners? Oh, it's Arizona. Why don't we do the four corners states? We'll get Arizona in here as well. So there we've got the four corners, the only, that's Mexico. Wait, it's probably, is it, it's, Colorado's in and Wyoming's out. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you're right. So trouble is we're recording this, so someone's gonna know, oh, you like flunked geography in third grade or whatever. So you say Wyoming is out and New Mexico is in. That's good. There we go. That looks better. Okay, so excellent. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to record ourselves building this pivot table. We ready to do it? Step one, before we record, and this will make a difference in how this records, if we already have a pivot table that exists on the data that we're going to build the next pivot table from, it will record the data differently. It's going to say, oh, go find the data that's used in this pivot table and build it off of that. No, we want to start from scratch. So I'm going to delete this existing pivot table and get back to just my crime sheet. That way, this will record the same for all of us. All right, so I'm up here somewhere. Maybe I'll just go ahead and come to Control Home, should take me up to the top. And let's build that pivot table again. But first, let's get recording. So Developer tab, record macro. And let's see, why don't I call this make pivot table. I'll put maybe Control Shift P. Don't do a Control P. Every time you try to print, you'll be making a pivot table. And I think we're ready to go. Okay, so we've been through this once, so I'm probably not going to go real slow step by step, but let's go ahead and just kind of build this pivot table up from scratch. So insert pivot table. We'll accept the defaults here. I'll bring my value in. And maybe I'll bring in my rows next, so I'll just go state, school, campus. Then I'll bring in my type and my label and my report year. I'll go through that same collapsing process, so I'll collapse crime, expand collapse, collapse entire field, and then do first at the college level and then at the state level to collapse this one. I'm going to leave my report year with all of these, but then let me come in to choose, whoops. I want to filter, there we go. I want to filter this down to just those 4 states. So that's Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. Oh, let's do one more thing too. Let's go ahead and re-expand out Utah. So, let's just say that we're making this, for some administrator here at BYU. So they're most interested in Utah, but these other 4 states that are, that we kind of hear, maybe we're in some conference together, we'd kind of like to be able to see the numbers for those as well. Of course, the user can drill down into this, all the data is here. We've just, brought it down to this as the starting point. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, but I know that I went through that pretty quickly. So let's give you a minute to be able to get that caught up. All right, so let's go. We've stopped, I've stopped recording. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code that we have here. So module 1, here's make pivot table. This code is really pretty daunting. We look at it and think, oh my gosh, how can we ever get a handle on this? First of all, there's a lot of it and it looks pretty complex and really long statements, and that's a lot to work with. But a lot of this code here is not necessary. So we're going to kind of clean it up. It turns out that, and this is common with the macro recorder, quite often you've got defaults that happen. We create a pivot table. It gets created with all of its defaults. Well, when they wrote the macro recorder here for the pivot table, they said, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and record what those defaults are so that the VBA programmer can come by and say, oh, look, here's all these defaults. I could change those values. But if you're happy with the defaults, we don't need the lines that's setting them because they'll get set automatically. Actually, they're just kind of trying to help us here a little bit. But let's go ahead and start kind of here at the beginning. So first thing that we're seeing is sheets.add. Now, you might have where you've selected a cell first, just depending on did you click somewhere after you started recording or not. But first thing that we're saying here is we're going to add a sheet. That looks pretty good. Okay, we'll just leave that one the way it is. We'll want to come back and deal with it in a minute, but let's come and look at the next statement. So here's sheets.select. We don't need that. But this is one long statement. Ah, boy, that just looks hard to deal with. So let's just kind of pick it apart. Not so bad. Active workbook. What's that saying? Yeah, out of all the workbooks, whichever one is active. I'm going to go ahead and change this one because this code is really written to work on this workbook. The workbook that's actually holding the code. I don't really anticipate saying we've got this workbook open and another workbook open and we want to build a pivot table on this data over here. It's possible, and that's why it records this way. But instead, I'm going to say, let's put this workbook. What's the difference between active workbook and this workbook? Active workbook is the active workbook. That one's pretty straightforward. This workbook is, yeah, it's the workbook that is holding this line of code. That line of code is in some workbook. Which workbook is it in? That's what that would refer to. Okay, so now it looks like there's a property of the workbook class called pivot caches. Oh, what's a pivot cache? So it turns out that when we build a pivot table in Excel, probably the most common place is that the data is actually sitting on a worksheet in Excel. But that's not the only place. Where else can we have our data reside and have the pivot table get built in Excel? Anyone know? Anyone ever built pivot tables on data that wasn't in Excel? You're in Excel building a pivot table, but it's somewhere else. I haven't done that very much. Well, it turns out we can just say we want to connect on to the corporate database. And that's where we want to pull the data from. It could be that we've got an analytics server, not a database, but an analysis server. And we can connect on to like a cube, what they call a data analysis cube. There's lots of different places that the data can come from. It could be sitting like in a comma-separated variable file, just here on my machine, not in the workbook. And so because there's so many different places that the data can come from, when they're making the pivot table, they said, you know what? Instead of having the pivot table know about all these different kinds of data sources, let's make a different object called a pivot cache. Pivot cache then says, wherever the data is coming from, we're going to put it into a pivot cache. And then the pivot table can just look at that pivot cache. It doesn't really matter where the data is coming from because by the time we've got it to the cache, the pivot table is ready to work with it. And so it turns out that's what we got to deal with, this thing called a pivot cache. Now, we see this is a collection of all the pivot caches in the workbook, but now we're going to call the create method of the pivot cache. Now, what's complex here is that we've got parentheses. So we're starting with parentheses here, and the closing parenthesis happens here. So this is the end of the create method of the pivot caches class. So what is this? What's going on here? Whoops. If that's the end of the create, what's this dot create pivot table? What's going on? Anyone want to take a stab at that? It's like witchcraft or something. Go ahead. Exactly right. So it's first saying, listen, we're creating the pivot cache, but that must mean that this create method returns a reference to something. What do you think it returns a reference to? Not where the data is. Oh, well, it returns a reference to the cache that just got created. Like when we create a new worksheet, the add method returns a reference to the worksheet that got created. So that's why we can say set s equal to worksheets.add, is because we can, it sends a reference back. Same thing here. But instead of assigning that to a variable the way we normally do, they said, listen, we just want to, this is going to be a pivot cache to here. Let's just call that pivot cache's create pivot table method and create a pivot table all in one fell swoop. So the one statement creates the pivot cache and then uses that cache to create the pivot table. Whew, that's more than I want to do in one statement. So let's go ahead and split this off. I'm going to take the create pivot table method and just bring it down a couple of lines. Ooh, this is no longer syntactically valid. And the reason is when I put parentheses around the argument list, it means I am trying to do something with the value that came back. Well, what was I doing before? I was calling a method of the value that came back. But in this case, I think I'd like to just remember that I want to get a reference to that pivot cache. So let's just declare a variable up here at the top, dim PC, as a pivot cache. And now when we create that pivot cache, we're going to say set PC equal to, and then the create method. Okay. So as I look at this data, I look at this statement, is there anything that I should feel nervous about with respect to this code being able to be reusable? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you answered one. Let's take it here. Yeah, this source data would be great as long as I don't get any new data, but I think the whole idea here is that when the 2011 report comes out, if they ever publish it, then we'll need to bring that in, and we'd like to create a pivot table including that data too. And this is hard-coded to look right there. So you might think, oh, wow, we've got to format a string. This source data is taking a string. We've got to build a string to anticipate that. And that would be a little bit of work. But it turns out source data can take a string, or it can take a reference to a range. And that'll be a little bit easier for us to build up. So I'm going to delete this. And we'll need to figure out what's the range that we can build. Now, it turns out our data, actually the sheet has two names. You'll remember this. One is the name that appears on the tab, and one is the code name, or the name that I refer to this through code. So it's already called data. We don't have to build another, like bind another variable onto it. We can just refer to it as data. So it'll be the data sheet. And then there's like several ways I can refer to a range. So I could just say, you know what, this data starts in A1. Let's just start in A1 and get the current region. But just to introduce you one that we haven't seen yet before, I'm going to say I want the used range. Used range can be really handy sometimes. The used range is the smallest rectangle on the sheet that encloses all of the data. It doesn't matter where your data are. You're just going to say, you know, got something kind of starts here in B16 and goes down to Z22. Then just it would make that smallest rectangle that can hold all of that data. That's your used range. Yeah. Oh, is it the same as Control A? And the answer is no. Let's just take a look. So if I come back here and I'm on my data here, and I do Control A, the first thing Control A do is it's going to kind of go out and select the current region. So it's going to, if I hit Control A again, you might think, well, maybe that will go to the used range, but it doesn't do that. It goes to the whole worksheet. So Control A doesn't get us to either way on that. Okay, now the truth is I could probably just say used range, but what will surely happen is someone will come over here and they will make a note. They'll say, remember, Utah Valley State College changed their name to Utah Valley University. So the numbers, it's one university that switched. And if I just use the used range, then it'll pull that in as well. So instead, I'm going to say, you know what? I want to go to the first cell in the used range. So dot cells, number 1. And from there, I want to extend to the current region. And so we could have done data range A1 current region, but I just wanted to introduce you to this notion of the used range. It's nothing specific to this example. It's just one way for us to get to that upper left-hand corner of the data and then accept all. So this would also work if someone came in and decided, you know what, I want to put some blank lines above this and I want to put some blank lines to the left. If we were just using A1 current region, we'd miss the data. But now, as long as there's no data out here, we'll still find that data. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the way it was. Okay, so now we have the pivot cache. One thing to kind of be aware of with the pivot cache is that, you might, like the first time I looked at this code, I thought, oh no, this is going to be a problem, because if I run this code twice, I'm going to create 2 pivot caches looking at the same data set. I don't know, exactly what a pivot cache uses in terms of resources, how much memory it uses or how much disk space it uses to be able to build that pivot cache, but I don't think I want to have two pivot caches looking at the same data set. Well, it turns out the create method of the pivot cache's object is smart enough to say, oh, you're trying to create a pivot cache for a set of data that already exists. We already have a pivot cache for it. In that case, it won't create another one. It will just return a reference to the one that already exists. So we can create multiple times and it won't add them up. It will just go, oh yeah, we've already got that one. We'll send you back a reference to that one. So it's actually pretty slick that way. We don't have to go and look, does a pivot cache already exist on this data? And if so, don't create it, otherwise do create it. Okay, so that's gonna be pretty good. So now we've got this create pivot table that's not quite working because we don't have an object in front of it. So what should we put here? Yeah, this was before it was running on the pivot cache that got created, and now we've captured a reference to that pivot cache. So now we're just going to say pc.create pivot table, and that should give us the pivot table. But as I look at this, do I see anything that is troublesome about the code? And the answer is yeah. I'm going to break this between arguments instead of here at the beginning. So let me put that down and then bring this up. So we can say we've got this destination that's looking where? Sheet 6 for me, probably sheet 2 for some of you, or sheet 2 or 3, just depending on how many sheets you'd created in this session of Excel. And so that's going to be a problem, because what sheet do we want this to go on? Do we want it to go on to sheet 6? No, which one? Say it again. Yeah, the one we added right here. So what are we going to do? Yeah, we got to capture a reference to that. So dim s as a worksheet, set s equal to sheets.add. And now, just like our source data can take either a string or a range, the same thing here. So it's looking on row 3, column 1, that's A3. So I'm just going to come here and say s dot range A3. So that's the destination. It's going to go into A3 of the whatever sheet we just created. What's the name of that sheet? We don't know. We don't care. We've got a variable that refers to it. Question here? Why is that like the table of state and everything? Oh, really good question. So how come we had parentheses up here around the argument list, but no parentheses down here? Anyone want to take a shot at that one? This is one we've kind of struggled with since the beginning of the semester. It's an unfortunate decision they made in the design of the language. Today, we better, just put parentheses everywhere. But there's a reason why we have some and not others. So parentheses gives you the order of the arguments. That's not what it is. Here? Yeah, it's because when there's the parentheses, we're doing something with the value that comes back. And so in this case, we had the parentheses because we were doing something with the returned object. What were we doing? Well, initially, we were just calling the create pivot table, but then we changed what we were doing with it. We were just catching it and putting it into a variable. But here, we weren't doing anything with it, and so no arguments go around or no parentheses go around the argument list. My life would be so much better if you always put parentheses, but that's just not the way the language is. It's a kind of a tough thing to grasp. When do you use them, when do you not use them? But in this case, we do want to put the parentheses in because this is going to return a reference to, can you guess? Yeah, this would be return a reference to the pivot table that it creates. And so let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Dim pt as a pivot table. And then let's set pt equal to the create statement, but now we'll have to put parentheses around the arguments. And we're doing pretty good here. So we've got the range now. It's going to go to the right sheet for that range, but this one's a little troubling to me. Am I allowed to have 2 pivot tables named pivot table 2 in my workbook? I don't remember. I think we probably can, as long as they're on different worksheets. And our intention is to put only one pivot table on a worksheet here. But it turns out we don't need to specify the name here because it's going to have a name. It'll just be whatever the default name is. So I'm going to get rid of this argument altogether. In fact, that's so short now, I'll bring this up onto one line. So now we've got a pivot. We've created a pivot cache, and we've created a pivot table based on that pivot cache. And importantly, we've got variables that are referring to each of those two objects independently in memory. All right, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put a stop in right here. I'm just going to run this and make sure that this structure is working. That was kind of a lot of code to change. Can I write that much VBA and have it work the first time? Probably not. Let's give it a shot. No, looks like I didn't have an error, but I should at least now have a pivot table on that new sheet. And sure enough, I've got a pivot table here. It's not configured yet, but it did build the pivot table right here on sheet 7. Excellent. Question over here? Oh yeah, we took a parameter out. How can we do that? And leave a comment in there. And the reason is because this is using one of the two conventions for passing parameters to like a procedure, or in this case, a method. One is we just have to supply a value in the right order. That's kind of the older approach in the world of programming. You got to supply all the values in the right order. But a newer approach is to say, listen, we don't want to have to supply, there's a lot of optional values here. We don't have to supply them all. We'll just accept the default when we don't use them. And in this case, if we say, instead of saying, well, we know that table destination is the first one, so just put the table destination, that's what this would be. We're saying, no, we're going to tell it the name of the variable that we're assigning. And so it's actually a special variable called a parameter, but that's the name of the parameter. And that's why we've got this kind of strange syntax here, :equals, which is what says we're not really doing an assignment statement, but this is just the name of the variable that we're passing in. And that :equals kind of goes way back in programming. That's one of the old language ways of doing an assignment. They just kind of co-opted it here in VBA. Question? Oh, version 6 is just a little bit better than version 5. Question is, what's version 6? And do you all have version 6? Did anyone record with version 4 or anything? So I think what it's saying is, I don't know for sure, but I think this is probably like the version of what this create pivot table is going to do. Like it may have kind of a certain set of defaults that it takes depending on the version, but I don't know. My guess is because it says default right there, we could probably get rid of that one too. And it would probably just go to whatever the current version is. Now, one thing that would be a little bit different is that let's suppose that we get Excel 2021 or whatever the next version of Excel is going to be, and the default version there is version 7, and it's got a different set of defaults. By leaving the default in here, what we're saying is even if the way that new pivot tables are made have different default values, we're saying no, stick with the ones that was the way when this was recorded. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave it, even though I think the code would work just fine by taking it out. Other questions? Okay. Yeah, so I think we're good up to this point. We've got our sheets built. I'm going to go ahead and stop this and probably take my stop out. Okay, so let's just kind of go through these next ones here. So we've got sheet 6 select. We're selecting the sheet that it created. Now, it's not going to be sheet 6. So this probably should be S instead of sheet 6. It's whatever sheet we created. But it turns out we don't even need this line. Why not? There's no reason for us to select S. Yep. Oh, so maybe this doesn't need to be active for it to get changed. That may be true, but that's not the reason I'm looking for. There's another kind of more direct reason why selecting it, not only do I not need to do it, it won't do anything. Yeah, that's the sheet we just added. It is the active sheet. Why did the macro recorder record this? I don't know, but we did. We didn't activate it, but it recorded, so we're going to get rid of that. Likewise, there's no reason for us to select a particular cell on that sheet. It just did. All right, now let's look at this next block here. It says with active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. That's a problem. What's our pivot table called? Ah, that's true. What I meant to say is, what is our pivot table named? We don't know. We just, whatever it's going to be named, we're going to be named. We didn't set the name, but we anticipated this, right? Because that's the whole reason that we said we want a reference to the pivot table. So here, exactly right. We can just say with the pivot table. We're going to change all these properties of our pivot table. That's the whole reason that we wanted to capture that pivot table variable, a reference to where that pivot table is, so that we could kind of simplify the code here. Now, all of this code here is just kind of telling us what the defaults are. It's like when the guys wrote the macro recorder, they're like, you know what? They might want to change some of these things. So why don't we just kind of record for them what it was, the default. And you know what? That's more overhead than I want. I'm just going to get rid of this whole with and with block, even though I just changed it to make it work with PT. I just don't need this. So we've kind of got rid of that extra code there. It really wasn't doing anything for us. It's instructive, but not necessary. Question here? Really? So the comment is, yours didn't even record that. What version of Excel are you on? Are you on like Excel 2019? You're on 365, same as me. Interesting. You're on 216, so that would make sense that it would record different on 216. Now yours might be recording different because you're on Mac. Are you running the Mac version or are you running Windows version on Mac? So, and your Mac as well. Yeah. So that's a good thing we're getting rid of it, because you know yours guys don't even record it. So that'd be a lot of typing to have to type in there. We don't want to do that. Yeah. So we'll just get rid of it. That sounds great. Yeah. And remember, the macro recorder is part of what gets updated when you update Excel, right? So record things differently. Yeah, thank goodness too, because I remember, you know, when we made the shift to 2007, the macro recorder was terrible. It's like, oh, you know, I think I'd like to record, you know, see what it's like to make a chart. You record yourself creating a chart in 2007, nothing. Didn't record anything about making the chart. So we're bringing it along. Okay. So let's kind of separate this with block out so we can kind of look at it together. So again, this is a little more wordy than it needs to be, but let's take a look. So this is a with block. So we've got two statements that are happening based on the same object. And what object is this? Yeah, well, this is getting to our pivot table, so we could replace this with PT, but it's just asking for the pivot cache object of the pivot table. We've already got that. What is it? Yeah, our PC is the pivot cache. I'm not really sure for such a small object identifier, I really want to use the with block here. So I'm going to cut that out of there, and I'm going to just put this in front of both of these lines. And I'm going to get rid of my with and my end with. Again, I think what I've got here, these are probably just defaults as well that I could get rid of, but I'm going to leave them in. And now the rest of our lines are now configuring the pivot table itself. So let's take a look at simplifying this code and actually making it so it will work. And you see why this code has no hope of working the second time is because the pivot table is not going to be named that the second time through. It won't, well, if your other pivot table still exists, you'll be changing a different pivot table than you just created. All right, so anywhere, in fact, should we do a find and replace or should we do them by hand? Do them by hand? Somebody's saying find and replace. It's not too bad doing by hand. So, and it's probably instructive for us to kind of see where it happens. So any place that we see this, I'm just going to change that with PT. So my pivot table, it's got repeat all labels. It's like a method, and we're giving it a constant, which is like, you know, just some numbers, probably 2 or 3. They're just telling it how to repeat all labels. That probably means we're going to repeat the labels. That one's not so interesting. Well, let's look at this active sheet now. What is this doing? Oh, yeah. So here's the first one where we're definitely doing something specific to this data set. So active sheet, pivot tables 2, that's PT. Add data field. Oh, look at this. And the data field we're adding is a data field also on this pivot table. Okay. So this one wouldn't have gotten caught by a find and replace because it's broken onto 2 lines. But that's going to be PT. Okay, so we're adding a data field. I'm sorry, we're adding a data field. So we're taking one of our pivot fields and making it into a data field. Take this pivot field value and make it into a data field. And by the way, what operation are we going to do on that? It's going to be a sum. And what are we going to label that as? Sum of value. You know, we could change that to say total. Total is probably a better word for that. All right, so that one looks pretty good. All right, let's take a look at this next one. So here, again, we got pivot table here. So PT. Let's see, up there we added a data field. Here, what are we doing? Oh, we're changing the orientation of the pivot field to be a row field. We're changing two things. So we're making state a row header, right? Making the orientation of that field for the row. And we're putting it in the first position. How many, before I run this line, how many row fields do I have? None. I'm putting this one in. I'm going to put it at position what? What do you think? Could I tell it to go to position 3? No, there's only going to be one there. I don't need to tell it where to go at all. So I'll really be able to simplify this one just by bringing this in, get rid of the width. I only have really one statement to do here. Don't have to set the position because the position is going to be that first position. And in fact, that's exactly what my next two statements are doing, right? I've got the state as a row field, and then I've got school next, and then campus. So, and the only thing different in those lines is what the field is. So let's go ahead and bring school in, and let's bring campus in, and we've really simplified that block of code as well. So we've taken those kind of long width blocks and just simplified them onto bringing this pivot field, then this, or set this row field, set the next one, set the next one. Incidentally, that's exactly what we're doing for the next two as well, but they're just column fields. So probably even easier just to copy this and say, oh, it's not going to be a row field, it's going to be a column field. And we're going to have two of them. One is type, will be the first one that goes in. One is label. And we've just, again, simplified that code to where it's quite a bit more readable. Question, go ahead. Yeah, the question is, if you don't actually specify what position, they're just going to go on the end, and the answer is that's exactly right. So I'll put the first one in, it'll be number 1. I'll put the next one in, it will be number 2. The next one will be number 3. Now, you know, if we had recorded this differently, where instead of putting them in that order, we would have, like, you know, dragged it in and like put in the state and then the campus and put the school between those two, then we would also, we'd still want to do this, but we would have to change the order in which these happened. Oh yeah, so if you have something in position 2 and you set something else into position 2, that the one you set to position 2 will become position 2, everything else will shift down. That's exactly right. All right. Oh, another thing that's pretty similar here too is the report field. This one strikes me as being a little more complex, but maybe it's not. Pivot fields report year. Yeah, the orientation is a page field. It's just the same. And there's only one, that one in total, so no reason to specify the position. So far, so good. Might be a good place for a sanity check. So I'm going to put a stop right here. I'll run my code. I got to the stop. That's great news. I'll go take a look and see what it did. Yeah, looks like it's built this pivot table out, got the data into it now. Sheet 7 had a pivot table, but nothing in it. Sheet 8 that I've just created looks like it's fully specified now. We haven't configured it the way we want it, but it's looking pretty good so far. Questions? I'll go ahead and stop that code and remove the stop. Okay, so now it looks like we're modifying the show detail. And again, here we had to select these ranges to be able to record that, but no reason to select the ranges here. So I'll delete those select ranges. And everywhere I've got my active sheet, pivot table 2, it's going to change to PT. And that's collapsed down now, all the show detail. So none of those 3 dimensions, those 3 dimensions should all be collapsed down to be a small, kind of data set. We can look at the summary at the top level and then drill into it for the specifics. All right. This next one is hideous. So interesting that we kind of have this whole group. And what are we doing? This is where we're turning off which ones are visible. We've got a filter that we're setting. And so we're saying, all right, with this state pivot field, we're going to make one of the pivot items not visible. We're set the visibility to false. So we've got a with block that takes us from Alabama to Washington. And then apparently that was enough. So we have another with block that takes us from West Virginia to Wyoming. No idea why that records that way. Certainly, we could simplify this just by taking that out and bringing them into just one block. But there's a more fundamental problem here. First of all, Idaho's not here. There's no Idaho. I don't know why. Maybe they don't have any crime in Idaho. Maybe that's the whole point. Or for some reason, it's not getting reported to the FBI. Or more likely, when I was building this data set, I somehow skipped Idaho accidentally. That's probably the real reason that we're like this. So the next time we bring data in, let's suppose it has Idaho, are we going to have, is Idaho going to, we want it to be collapsed because we only want to be showing, right, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona. So that's a problem. If Idaho all of a sudden shows up into our data set, it's not going to be turned off. Well, can we just tell it to turn it off here anyway? Well, no, because if there is no Idaho, then it'll cause an error when we try to refer to one named Idaho, right? If we all of a sudden say Idaho, and there is no Idaho, and there is no Idaho, that'll be an error. There's no pivot item named Idaho. So what are we going to do? Any thoughts? In the back? Is there a way for us just to say, set them all to false? No. Yep. We could, yeah, we could say, you know what, let's make an if statement, say if Idaho's here, make it false. That would work. That's more work than I want to do though. Is there a way for us to loop across all these? Well, what do you think? It says here, pivot items, and then we're identifying in quotes something like by its name. That's exactly right, yeah. So let's do it. Instead of doing this all, instead of kind of doing them one at a time, well, we'll still do them one at a time, but we're not going to need to know which ones they are. Let's just set them all to false. So let's use a for each loop for this one. So I'm going to dim, now let's see, what is this? I'm going to call it a pivot item as a pivot item. P-I-V-O-T-I-T-I-T-E-M. There we go, pivot item. Right, and the reason I'm choosing it could just be object, dim PI as object. But I'm using pivot item because I know that these are pivot items because it's a collection of pivot items. So now I'll just build a for each loop. For each PI in, let's see. I guess we've got our pivot table dot pivot fields state dot pivot items. That should be the collection. So for each pivot item in the collection of pivot items for the state field in our pivot table, we're going to do something. We're going to treat them all the same way. Next. And what are we going to say? PI dot visible equals false. Let's put a stop here and just check to make sure our loop is doing what it's supposed to do. This looks pretty good, but it's going to cause a little problem. Let's run it and see what it is. unable to set the property, the visible property of the pivot item class. Fiddlesticks. Let me debug. And I wonder if I can hover over this. PI. Nope, I'm gonna have to do it in the immediate window. I'm wondering what my PI's value is. PI's value is Wyoming. Wyoming, what's significant about Wyoming? What's special about Wyoming? Well, they were the first state to give women the vote, but it's like, that's the last one. I made it through all the rest of them, and I died on Wyoming. I was so close. Why did it die? What do you think? Yeah? One of them has to be visible. It's like the same thing with a worksheet. You can't make all of your worksheets invisible. You got a workbook, you got to have a visible worksheet. Same thing here. You got a pivot table, you got to have something in the pivot table. Oh, this was looking so easy until that happened. What can we say? Just skip it if it's Wyoming. Yeah, but we're not sure Wyoming's going to be the last one. We're not sure even that Wyoming's going to be in the set. You know, just the way the data might change. What we are sure is there's 4 that we want to not go invisible. So let's do this. Let's come here and say if, plus some if statement, then we'll make this invisible. We'll probably put this on one line. It might be too long to put on one. Let's find out. So we're really saying if the pivot item's value is Utah, or if it's Colorado, or if it's New Mexico, or if it's Arizona, then actually, if it's not any of those, let's do it this way. That's kind of a lot to type. There's just kind of a little shortcut here. I'm going to say in string. I'm going to look, start at the first character. I'm going to look at some string, which I haven't defined yet. And I'm going to look for my pivot item's value. Now, in string is going to return a number to indicate where it found one string inside the other. So when I get down here and I'm looking at Colorado, I want to know if Colorado is in this list, what would it return? Let's say if Colorado was the first one in the list, what would it return? It won't return true. It would say, I think I heard it. 1, because it returns the character, the position where it finds it. And how does it tell me that it didn't find it? Yeah, 0. So I'm going to say if the in string here returns 0, then we'll set it to false. And then I'll just specify what I'm looking for here. Colorado, Utah. I don't even have to put the spaces between them. I could run them all together, but I'll space them out. New Mexico, Mexico, and Arizona. Okay, so now we're saying when we look at the value of, which of these pivot items it is, we're saying is California in this list? Returns 0 because California is not here. Because it returns 0, this whole thing is true, and as a result, we set that visible to false. When we get to Colorado, we say Colorado in this, it returns a 1 because it found Colorado in here, and so this whole thing equals 1. So this expression is now 1 equals 0, which is false, and so we don't make it invisible. I'll stop that and run it again. And now we've made it through that loop. Let's just see what it created. Hey, look at that. Our 4 states now are showing and everything else is filtered off. Looks pretty good. Was there a question here? You got it? Okay, now if I remember right, there's only one more thing to do, and that's to re-expand Utah. Well, we don't need this long list of what we're doing here, so let me get rid of this one. Probably don't need to select A9, but that's, yeah, stop program, that's fine. And we've got this broken onto 2 lines. I'll bring it onto 1. I think we can just convert this one. Pivot table 2, that's PT. Pivot field state, yeah, we're just showing the detail on Utah. I think that's what we're after. So now I think we successfully build that pivot table out the way that we want it. Of course, we could, let's suppose that we've got to build, maybe there are we've got to build several different pivot tables with slightly different characteristics. maybe, this one gets built with, these 4 states showing. We have another one that gets built with the Pacific Northwest states showing. We have another one that's built with the Southeast states showing. So in that case, we'd probably just want to generalize this sub-procedure, and then we could just pass in a string, make a parameter here that we would pass in the string of the ones that we wanted to show, and we could have one procedure that makes all these pivot tables that are the same, but then would expand it differently depending on how it was parameterized. The question here? No? Yeah, just make it a parameter, and then we can't call this directly anymore. We'd have to make another procedure that calls it and passes it what we want. But now we've got this set up pretty well where we're saying, hey, if this is kind of the base structure of the pivot table, we could probably parameterize this to make it quite a bit more flexible. We won't here in this class. We're done with the example now. Questions? In the back, go ahead. Oh, the question is, what if we want to expand crime? We can probably figure that out from here. So we collapsed it. Where did we collapse it? Show detail false. Type school state. So type. So I think, yeah, actually, I think what we could do is just not have this line. Or, I think we could probably just come down here and set this one to true. This is we can't just expand crime. Oh yeah, we probably could. So we would make type, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. This will give us something. Let's take a look. It looks like we're also expanding enrollment here. So we should be able to collapse this one. So yeah, I think we can just kind of follow the same pattern and set this to say pivot items crime. And then I think this one should look different because enrollment information won't show. The total should still be there, but K will no longer be the detail on enrollment, even though it's just the same information. Yeah, so our crime total shows here, our information total is here. So this code now, not only is it dramatically better because it executes, but it's really quite a bit simpler. And that's just the nature of the macro recorder. It's doing what it can to record, but we're better than it is now. You weren't better when you first started in this class, but now you are. So you should be able to kind of look through it and say, how can we simplify this and work through it. Would I expect you to be able to do it as quickly as we did it today here in class? No, not a chance. But I think you're to the point now where you can kind of look at this and say, what's going on here? How can we simplify that? How can we clean this up? Any questions? All right, thanks for coming. Class dismissed.